Think for a second about the place that you work or any organization you care about. How does it judge its own successes and failures? At the end of a year, what kind of metrics does it use? What does it look at? If it's a business in which the chief goal is selling a product or service and making money, it probably looks at sales figures, income, profits, those kinds of things. But if it's an organization that plays a vital societal role, then what does it look at? Today, we need to talk about this because it speaks directly to a huge problem in the way that the news industry is structured. And that means there's a big step we can take to demand better and fix it. Also today, I'm tackling questions about the news from paid subscribers to my newsletter. People are asking whether certain things are true, whether they're trustworthy. Plus, chaos at the CDC endangers all of us. There's something important that the media is not explaining. It involves how smart leaders in the private sector have successfully reduced workforces. All that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So great to have you here. I am Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact checks the news. Welcome to the new people who have been joining us. It is so great to have you, and to all of you listeners who have been around for any length of time, including from the beginning. You might know my background is 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 at CNN, where I became lead on-air fact checker, but I always saw throughout all that time how desperately the media itself needs fact checking. Along with this show comes a newsletter, which is free. It's filled with links and more information. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. But this show is only possible because of supporters. And one great way to support the show is to choose to become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. These folks get goodies and perks and additional content. And when I'm figuring out the topics for this show, the first place I go is to the paid subscribers to the newsletter. And I've gotten a bunch of questions from these folks lately. These are questions that came in after the last two episodes. One was about the second anniversary of October 7th, and the next one was about hostages. Let's see, Joelle Kaufman sent a voice message. Now, she sent this along with a story from NBC News, but really, these same comments she has here could apply to lots of what we've been seeing lately in coverage of Gaza after the announced end of the war against Israel.
The misinformation in this article is gross. Why don't they wonder why the photos of Gazans celebrating don't look like famine at all? And do they not know that the genocide scholars are a sham? Just once, I'd love to read how Israel responded to October 7th by remaking the Middle East, defanging Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, while feeding their enemy and minimizing civilian deaths in the most challenging urban combat environment. Your recent episode was excellent and very hard to listen to because it was so emotional, raw, and troubling. Thank you for it.
Thanks, Joelle. And by the way, she has a book called Crushing the Cancer Curveball and now has her own podcast called Kicking Cancer's Ass. Let's dig into what she's talking about here, because the big mainstream media are not telling you the big story of what happened in that war. And all those things she just listed did happen. That doesn't mean that it's permanent. The terrorist groups you heard mentioned in there, Hamas and Hezbollah, they could grow. They could rise back up, and they're trying right now. This is a battle between a modern world and those who want to create a new global Islamist empire. Big news media do not admit that because it goes against their agenda. She mentioned in there the minimizing of civilian deaths. I got questions from a bunch of supporters about a new figure they've seen. One of them is Linda Ween. Thank you, Linda. She said she saw this report going around that Hamas lost 58,000 people in this war. And so some people are pointing to that, saying, hey, Hamas has been claiming that the overall death toll was 60-something thousand. And now they're hearing 58,000 were with Hamas. So that's very few civilians. So that's what's been circulating. There is confusion about the figure. It seems to originate from Trump, who said this.
Hamas has lost 58,000 people.
However, it's not clear that he had any source for that, and it would be very him to use a figure with no source. We don't have final figures. What we do know is throughout the entire war, the only source has been Hamas, and they've been including natural deaths. Just people normally die in every society. And they've been including the people that they kill. That's another part of what's so insane about the media reporting Hamas figures as though they're trustworthy. It's madness. Hamas kills people and includes those in the death toll, which the media then recites as though it's a fact and blames Israel for all of it. And no matter what, there were many, many fewer casualties and fewer civilian casualties than the hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in other wars still raging. Supporter Regina Guggenheim sent me that figure as well, and along with it, she sent this question. She said, why is mainstream media not publicizing the killing of Palestinian civilians and clans being killed by Hamas now that the ceasefire is in place? She added, I realize no Jews, no news, but ... Here's what she's talking about. Hamas has been lining up Gazans and killing them in the middle of the street while all these people stand around and watch them take videos on their cell phones, and there are people cheering. What no one is saying in the media is that this could never happen in Israel. Israelis would tackle anyone even trying to do that. But these people in Gaza are being killed by Hamas right now, and no one cares. Not the protesters who claimed to care about Palestinian civilians, and not the United Nations, and there are no emergency meetings, of course. There is some coverage of this in the media. It's not generally being played up as a big story in headlines, which far more people see than the actual stories. But the bias is even worse than that. These kinds of killings by Hamas were already going on throughout the war, and there's been virtually no coverage of it. Not just here, this is a problem worldwide. Sky News Australia did a good job of highlighting this the other day. Chris Kenny, someone I've talked about before, showed how a month ago he was calling out big mainstream Australian news outlets for ignoring proof of Hamas slaughtering people in Gaza. He explained that he was searching the websites for these news agencies and there was nothing. Now, he says, some of those same news agencies suddenly are at least reporting on these killings, but listen to how they're framing it.
Hamas executions they failed to report while the war continued, they now report as a threat to the peace plan. The ABC reported how 7 men were dragged into the Gaza City square, hands tied behind their backs, forced to their knees, and shot from behind as dozens of people looked on. The ABC report then said Donald Trump has previously given his blessing to Hamas to reassert some control of Gaza, at least temporarily. You see what they did there? When Israel was fighting a war against Hamas with Trump's support, Hamas executions were not worth reporting. Now there's a ceasefire, Hamas executions are worth reporting because they're Trump's fault.
Yep. These big news operations are not acting based on journalistic standards. They give you dribs and drabs of information mixed with lies to convince you to hate whoever they hate. So, Regina, as for your question, the determinant is what these news agencies feel is a story that they can use for their agenda. It's a fundamental, poisonous way of thinking in the brain, the nerve center of news operations. Next, Sarah, a listener in Atlanta, sent me a story from The Guardian and asked me whether it's true. The headline starts with the words, cruelest forms of torture. It puts those words in quotes. And then the headline goes on to say, freed Palestinians describe horrors of Israeli jail. Sarah points out that because of the source, The Guardian, she automatically distrusts it, which makes sense. The Guardian is a disaster. But she notes that many people would have discounted early reports of Abu Ghraib, which was a U.S.-run prison in Iraq in which people were abused and treated horribly. Let's see. Sarah writes, loving the podcast and continuing to share. Oh, thank you so much. All right, let me talk you through this. First of all, any country can have people who act horribly against people who are in detention. We don't know everything that happened inside this particular prison, but in democracies, there are processes for people to demand and get information about what's going on, especially on home soil. Something big that's different from Abu Ghraib, this alleged treatment was in Israel at home, in which lots of groups demand information and visiting rights and other things. We're seeing that in some ways in the United States these days, when the Trump administration's ICE forces have been rounding up people. We've got lawmakers and governors and other public officials and private groups saying you have to let us in to see the treatment. So these kinds of things can happen in democracies, but not being inside this facility where The Guardian is claiming this happened, I can look at this story and tell you journalistically, this story is not trustworthy. I want to empower all of you to know what to look for. So I'm going to tell you a few specific things that this story does. First, it takes an accusation and puts that in quotes in a headline when it said, quote, cruelest forms of torture. Putting that in a headline means they don't actually have that information. Now, sometimes you put quotes in headlines. There's nothing inherently wrong in that. But when it is an incendiary accusation, you're playing with fire and you should know it. They know that way more people see headlines than stories. People share headlines on social media. And because news agencies have lied so much about Israel, they assume everything bad written about Israel is true. This article in that headline then refers to freed Palestinians, not telling you that terrorists and other criminals who did demented, evil things were let go. One raped and murdered a 13-year-old. In that case, it was a 13-year-old boy. He raped him and beat him to death. Understand that these are people that Palestinians want freed. The media refuses to say this clearly. Cultures exist in Gaza. Many people who do horrific, evil things are worshipped, loved as heroes. What kind of society would possibly want someone like that returned? But this was someone they demanded in exchange for living hostages from Israel who had done nothing wrong, and the remains of slain hostages. As I record this, many of the remains have still not been returned. All right, back to this Guardian story. The Guardian writes about one detainee. There are always detainees during wars, people who are not charged with crimes as well. That's normal. People suspected of helping infiltrate, helping terrorists, helping the enemy. Gaza started this war, so of course there are Gazan detainees. All right, so this story says this, quote, his detention was marked by torture, medical neglect, and starvation at the hands of Israeli prison guards. Note what it does not say there. Alleged, or he said. This is the most basic journalistic rule. It's one everyone knows. This is something I talked about in episodes that I did about Matt Lauer and Ronan Farrow. There were news agencies that called women the victims of Matt Lauer. They were deciding that they were definitively victims instead of saying alleged. And as though that wasn't enough, there's yet one more thing that this story did. It left out context. Remember, truth equals facts plus context. In Palestinian culture, it's standard operating procedure. It's the MO. When you have been held by any Israeli forces for any block of time, you immediately complain that you were tortured, and they know that the media will say it's true, and the world will believe them. Coming up, big news for the nation's health as the Trump administration makes an absolute mess trying to fire all these people at the CDC. That can have very long-term repercussions for our society, and the media is not making that clear either. But first, a whole new way to hold the media accountable. It's time to take lessons from schools, police, and firefighters.
You know he is a big old liar. He's a liar. He's a goddamn liar. Liar, pants on fire, telling tales just to climb higher, dripping fake like it's designer. But I'm the match, boy, I'm the fire.
As a rule, I don't do social media battles, and I encourage other people not to as well. They're generally just a waste of time. But social media can be a great tool to get people truth. In fact, social media is an important tool to fight back in the mimetic warfare and influencing brand connectomes, two things you've heard about on this show. You can find me on social media on most of the platforms. I have my name. And since I am no expert at creating pretty graphics, I am happy to say that a listener to this show is now helping me with the content I'm sharing on Instagram. He is at Gabe Draws, Gabe Draws. He is awesome. Thank you, Gabe. So if you are on social media platforms, find me at Josh Lebs. You will see that sometimes somebody posts a lie and I reply and I say, that's factually untrue. Here are some facts. But that's not a battle because I don't go back and look at whether they even replied to that. So not wasting my time on that. Focusing on putting this together for you. But I see your shares, your likes, the way you amplify that content, and it helps drive the audience for this show. So let's hook up there on the social media platforms at Josh Lebs, JoshLevs. For most businesses, the biggest goal each year is to make money, to pull in profits. So at the end of a year, when the business analyzes how well it did, it generally looks at those kinds of numbers. But what about organizations that exist primarily to serve a crucial societal purpose? There, the metrics are usually different. I pulled up some YouTube videos from these kinds of organizations across the country in which they looked back at their last full year. So these came out after the end of 2024. Let's take police, for example. Here's how the Tallahassee Police Department reported on its successes.
The homicide unit cleared all 22 homicides in 2024 and helped solve a 1976 cold case, reminding us, no case forgotten, no truth untold. From hosting our first police career day to investing in officer wellness and expanding crime-fighting technology, TPD continues building towards a safer, stronger, and more connected Tallahassee.
Or how about firefighters? As you may know, I have likened journalism to firefighters. Journalists should be extinguishing the flaming lies and doing something about all these leaders with their pants on fire instead of letting people start more fires, which is what the current media does. Anyway, here is the Reno Fire Department looking back on 2024.
RFD deployed 264 resources to more than 100 wildland fires, contributing over 65,000 hours of work. These efforts brought nearly $2 million in reimbursements back to the department. Right here at home, we responded to 51,737 calls for service, an increase of over 2,000 from the previous year. Our commitment to service continues to grow along with our community.
Totally sensible metrics for a fire department to use. It's about impact in achieving societal goals. I'll put these videos in the newsletter, by the way, in case you want to see them. Oh, and yes, these are firefighters, but no, sorry, they're not shirtless and covered in canola. But hey, if that's your thing, go for it. Did I ever mention on this show that shirtless magazine cover that I did? Whatever. Anyway, let's look at one more kind of service profession, schools. Here is Bryant Public Schools in Arkansas.
5 Bryant schools were recognized for student performance and academic growth based on ESSA scores. The schools were Bethel, Spring Hill, Hurricane Creek, Hill Farm, and Collegeville. Davis and Hill Farm Elementaries were recognized by the Office of Education Policy for beating the odds for high growth on the ACT Aspire, even though the school serves a high percentage of students who participate in free and reduced lunch.
And because this is America in this era, I would be remiss to leave out this part of their video.
Bryant Public Schools continues to make the safety of students and staff a top priority. Each school has an armed presence on campus with 8 school resource officers and 9 commissioned school security officers. Security enhancements include shatter-resistant film at school entrances, live video monitoring for visitor identification, and access controls on main entrances to all buildings.
Ugh. By the way, I did an episode on a largely unknown media issue involving school shootings. If you haven't heard that, you might want to go back and check it out. Just scroll back in your feeds. It was episode 72. These are the kinds of metrics that groups focused on providing crucial societal services generally highlight. It's about their impact. But what about news agencies? How do they judge themselves at the end of a year? Totally different and nonsensical categories. There is no system in place to analyze to what extent they succeeded and failed in their mission. The biggest markers they have are awards. They love to get awards. I've talked about this in the past. Awards did good things for me in my career, and I appreciate them. And awards committees don't fact check reports. So they end up rewarding lies, literally. But even if that one report was good, what's happening in that case is the news agency is choosing a report or a collection of reports on a specific topic to submit. And the awards committee looks at that. There is nothing about the news agency's overall body of work for that year. So they could have lied constantly the whole year and then submitted one thing and gotten an award for that and used it to pretend that they were doing their job. And this gets at the whole thinking inside news. People should only be in journalism for the service of it. Instead, what news agencies generally do at the end of a year is talk about numbers and usually profits. They try to spin advertising figures, sales figures, subscription figures, those kinds of things, none of which has anything to do with whether they're getting people the truth. Maybe they have a ton of people who read, listened, or watched that year. But if all those people were lied to, that would be like a hospital having lots of people come in and then making them sicker. Imagine this. An organization does annual awards based on fact-checking. So, for example, the awards committee gets a bunch of fact checkers and takes 100 stories at random from any one news agency, the AP, New York Times, whatever, 100 stories at random, and analyzes how it did in fact checking those, what it got right and wrong, how good its sourcing was. So if it uses information from a terrorist organization without telling the audience that, that's a strike against it. There would be standard rules that all news agencies would be subjected to, and that would be one of the awards. And the award committee could open up to feedback from the public. Ask the public, what stories did you see from these news agencies that were problematic this year and why? And then have teams look into those and explore what the news agency did to correct them. Did they generally take action? Did they fix the problems? If not, why not? Which news agency did the best job of correcting mistakes? By the way, news agencies generally pay a bunch of money for each award submission. So there would be money to fund this kind of thing if news agencies were not terrified of submitting themselves for inclusion, just paying a fee for each category they want to be considered in, but then not submitting any specific pieces of work. If this became prestigious, news agencies would absolutely participate. I will tell you, there are organizations that try to do some general analyses, like analyze news agencies based on left-right stuff, where they fall in the political spectrum. There have been a couple that have tried to analyze based on trustworthiness, but they don't fact check and they don't do anything about sourcing. This is doable. It will probably take a foundation to make it happen. So if you or anyone you know is part of a foundation, send them this episode. Actually, tell them about this show in general. I did create the Media Fail Awards last year, in which listeners and people at the newsletter vote, and I will be doing the same thing again this year. It'll be in an additional stage this year. I'll have more options for you to vote on to choose who the finalists are, and then supporters of the show will be the ones voting on who the winners or losers are, having had the biggest, worst fails of the year. This can be done. I know how obsessed these places are with prestige and awards. Right now, there aren't any pushing them to do their job all the time. So let's create one. Why not? What a great way to disrupt the news. Coming up, news involving the nation's health and a big mess being caused by the Trump administration. I'll be right back.
The floor's your friend when it's hot. Roll like a log. Don't stop. Practice every day, so you'll be ready come what may. Stop, stand still, don't run. Drop down low, the fire's not a one. Roll around, get it off your skin. Stop, drop, and roll, let's do it again.
Do you remember the little engine that could? Let's talk about that for a second. The dangerous polarization taking over our society is being fueled by the media. And there's a reason for that. The market rewards it. These days, if you join a big lie of the right or the left, it's like you are put on a bullet train that speeds to numeric success. This show goes against the market, and so it is a much tougher, harder path to grow this show. We need your support to grow this movement for truth, to help fuel this train up the hill. Here are things you can do. Yes, you can become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. That's helpful. Also, there are free things you can do. Rate and review this show on the platforms, wherever you're listening to it now. Everyone who does that makes a huge difference because that's how those algorithms work. Tell individuals about this show. Contact someone you know and say, I think you specifically would find this episode interesting, and here's why. You can also sponsor episodes and tell sponsors about the episodes. You can find out all this information in the show notes and at my website, joshlebs.com. Let's root for truth so our society can come together. And let's prove to the market that you don't have to join a big lie to succeed. With your help, we can get there. Thank you. A friend of mine whom I used to work with in a major news agency once pointed this out. News agencies are often run by people who don't know much about business because, in general, people work their way up inside news and don't have experience as leaders in other industries. I was thinking about that amid the latest dangerous mess that Trump is making in the federal government. Throughout this year, the administration has been firing all these people from across tons of agencies, in some cases leaving only skeletal staff, if any, and then suddenly trying to unfire some people and get them to come back. This does not work. In recent days, the CDC has been going through this again. The administration fired about 1,300 employees at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then about half of them got notes saying, actually, no, you're not fired. The biggest danger, of course, is to public health. The CDC is not perfect. Everyone with a clear mind knows that. Of course, there have been mistakes made by the CDC. And, especially living where I do in Atlanta and having covered it over the years, I can tell you it is filled with so many people who are public servants just trying to keep America healthy and safe from diseases and epidemics. There has been coverage of this. Here's Nirav Shah, a former CDC official, interviewed on PBS.
The impact of them may not be seen for days, weeks, months, even years. But when that impact is materialized, it will be in the midst of a crisis or a catastrophe, when we are the last ones to know about a devastating biological threat, when all of our foreign adversaries have had weeks or months of lead time to be ready, and we are the ones who are scrambling.
I'll tell you, it looks like after that interview, he announced that he is tossing his hat in the ring for governor of Maine, running as a Democrat. The CDC firings are now in limbo due to a court ruling at least temporarily blocking Trump's firings during the shutdown. There's another side to this story, though, that I'm not seeing covered, the business side. There's nothing inherently wrong with saying that a workforce is bloated and that some people need to go. That does happen. How can it be done well? What would a smart strategy look like? Big news agencies don't even seem to be asking this. A smart strategy would mean analyzing departments, coming up with cost savings, determining how much money each department saves and makes for the government. I wrote about this in my latest piece for The Contrarian. One analysis just last month found that the country is hurt economically in immediate ways when funding to the CDC is slashed. It found that state and local governments lose way more money than the federal government saves. It's a net loss for the country. And that's just the immediate stuff. The economic impact of diseases and epidemics can be massive and devastating. We should be hearing from business people in this story as well, who explain why it's such a terrible financial move for the country too. Maybe that would help wake up some people who blindly support Trump's every move. We, the people, should not have to choose between a political party that endangers democracy from the left or the right. We shouldn't have a media ecosystem that demands we downplay the threats from one side or the other, that pretends the pro-terror mobs aren't pro-terror mobs, or that pretends Trump is not making a mess. Enough of this madness. We need to show the media that they stand corrected. Let me know what you think. There are two great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter, and the other way is through a form at my website. Just go to joshlebs.com, JOSHLEVS.com, and you will see the form right there. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.